Tonight, let your mind drift like the ocean itself, calm, steady, endless. You'll feel a quiet sense of peace, the gentle warmth of an imaginary campfire beside you, and the slow rhythm of history told in a voice meant to help you rest. As we unfold tonight's story, you might find your eyes growing heavier, your breathing softer, and your thoughts floating like waves. This is not a tale of noise or chaos, but of stillness, the kind that lulls the world to sleep. Before we start, I'd like to ask, from which country are you listening tonight? What time is it where you are? Whether it's late evening or the early hours before dawn, I'm glad you're here. Before we go any further, if you enjoy quiet stories like this one, you can gently tap the like button or subscribe. You don't have to do it now, maybe later, after you've drifted off. Now, let's return to April 14th, 1912. Imagine the Atlantic Ocean stretching endlessly beneath the stars. The Titanic, a floating city of light and pride, glides through the calm waters. The sea is so smooth that it looks like a sheet of dark glass. You can almost hear the soft hum of its engines, steady and confident, unaware of what lies ahead. Somewhere deep inside that ship, passengers are falling asleep to the rhythm of the waves. The air smells faintly of salt and polished wood. Gentle laughter fades in the corridors, replaced by quiet footsteps and the faint closing of cabin doors. The night has no wind, only silence. The kind of silence that almost feels sacred, not in worship, but in awe of how peaceful the world can be. Above, the stars shine brighter than they ever do on land. Sailors often said it felt like sailing through the heavens themselves. And perhaps that's true, a sea of darkness below, a sky of light above. The line between the two seems to disappear. If you listen carefully, you might almost hear the ocean breathing softly, like a living thing that's fallen asleep with you. For a moment, close your eyes and feel the cold night air in your imagination. Crisp, clean, untouched by noise or city lights. This is the calm before everything changes. The kind of calm that feels eternal, even though we know it never is. And yet, there's comfort in that thought. Every calm night, no matter how brief, holds its own beauty. Somewhere on the bridge, the officers watch the horizon. Their breath forms small clouds in the air. They exchange quiet words, their voices blending with the low hum of machinery. Nothing seems wrong. In fact, everything feels perfect, too perfect, perhaps. They can't know that history is already unfolding beneath that same, quiet sky. Let your thoughts wander like the ship does, slowly, gracefully, unhurried. Feel the rhythm of the sea under your imagination, the pulse of the waves matching the rhythm of your breathing. You're safe here, in this quiet story. You're meant to drift with it, not rush through it. If your mind starts to wander, that's all right. Just come back to the sound of calm history and let it carry you again. Back inside the Titanic, the great halls glow with soft golden light. The lamps sway gently with the motion of the ship. Some passengers sit by the windows, staring into the endless dark, lost in thought. Maybe they're thinking of home, or of the adventure that lies ahead in America. Their hearts are full of hope, not fear. In the lower decks, the workers finish their shifts. The air is warmer there, filled with the sound of machines, the hiss of steam. One man wipes his brow, another leans against the wall, tired but content. They talk quietly about letters they'll send when they arrive. Ordinary moments, unremarkable, yet somehow sacred in their simplicity. And above them, the stars continue their quiet watch. The night stretches endlessly, a mirror for the dreams of those on board. It feels as if time itself has slowed down. The ship moves forward, but the world stands still. The sound of water brushing against the hull is like a whisper, patient and soft. If you're starting to feel your eyelids grow heavy, that's good. That means you're right where you should be, in the rhythm of the story. Just stay here for a while, between history and dream. This is the kind of story that doesn't demand attention. It invites rest. You're safe, listening to the past as it drifts gently through time. Back on the open deck, a few passengers step out for a walk. Their breath curls in the air as they talk quietly, pointing at constellations they can barely name. The sky feels close enough to touch. One man remarks that he's never seen stars so bright. Another smiles and says, "It's like the world forgot to move." That phrase lingers in the air, like the faint echo of a thought that history might remember. The world, for one brief night, truly did seem to stop moving. Everything was too calm, too beautiful, too still. It's the kind of peace that almost feels heavy, because somewhere deep inside, it feels borrowed. As the clock nears midnight, most people have already gone to sleep. The ship continues forward, slicing through the invisible cold. The engines thrum softly beneath the decks, the heartbeat of something vast and alive. No one suspects that the ocean, so calm and silent, hides anything at all. Just a soft reminder, if your thoughts begin to wander, let them. You don't have to stay alert. You can let the story do the thinking for you. The past doesn't need your attention. It only asks for your quiet presence. And soon, as the ship sails deeper into the night, we'll drift with it toward the next chapter of its story. The clock hands move closer to midnight, but the night feels timeless. On the bridge, the officers glance at their instruments, their breath visible in the freezing air. The wind has vanished completely, leaving the sea unnervingly still. One of them murmurs how calm it is, too calm, perhaps, and they share a quiet smile, unaware that the ocean silence is not a comfort but a warning. In the crow's nest high above, two lookouts stand watch, wrapped tightly in their coats. Their faces sting from the cold, their eyes fixed on the horizon. Without binoculars, they rely only on what they can see, scanning the dark with quiet determination. The stars are so bright they almost hurt to look at. And yet, the sea below them remains black, endless, unknowable. Far below, the ship glides on with confidence. The passengers sleep in soft beds, surrounded by the gentle creaks of the hull and the distant pulse of the engines. The steady rhythm of machinery sounds almost like a lullaby, mechanical, yet strangely human. Somewhere, a clock chimes softly. Another hour of calm passes unnoticed. The night air grows colder. Frost begins to form along the metal railings and the deck. Lanterns flicker faintly, their glow golden and warm against the dark. The sound of the sea brushing against the ship's sides is barely audible, more like a sigh than a wave. If you were there, you might have felt the stillness deep in your chest, like a held breath waiting to be released. Somewhere on the promenade, a man steps outside, just for a moment. He looks at the stars and adjusts his coat. His footsteps echo on the wooden floor, slow and steady. He feels the cold bite at his fingers, but he doesn't mind. He's thinking of the journey ahead, of the life waiting across the ocean. For now, he feels safe. The ship is steady, and the world is calm. If you're still awake, take a slow breath in. Feel how calm this story is, how quiet history can be when told without rush. The goal is not to relive the tragedy, but to rest in the stillness before it came. Let the gentle rhythm of words keep you grounded, like the faint rocking of a ship beneath your mind. Down below, in the mailroom, Clark sort letters by lamplight. The air is warmer there, filled with the smell of ink and paper. One of them hums a quiet tune. They laugh softly about how tired they are, unaware that soon, those letters will never reach their destination. In that moment, they're part of a living story, ordinary people doing their work with quiet pride. On the upper decks, a few passengers linger in the smoking lounge. A card game ends, laughter fading into conversation about the sea, about life, about tomorrow. They speak softly, as if they sense the weight of the night, even if they don't understand it. The lights shimmer faintly against polished brass and glass. Everything glows with calm elegance. The ocean, vast and dark, watches silently. No waves rise, no wind moves. It's as though the world itself is holding still, waiting. This kind of silence isn't empty. It's heavy, full of unspoken meaning. The stars above shimmer in their eternal dance, reflected perfectly in the sea below. The sky and ocean become one mirror, holding the ship between them like a fragile dream. Take another slow breath. Let your shoulders relax. You're floating now, not in water, but in sound. The story flows gently, like the tide moving under moonlight. There's no rush to reach the end. Just stay in this calm moment, safe within the distance of history. The past can't hurt you. It only whispers softly, asking to be remembered. In the engine room, men shovel coal into furnaces that glow orange against the steel walls. Sweat mixes with frost. The ship hums with quiet power. Every few minutes, one of them looks at a gauge, nods, and returns to work. They trust the ship completely. To them, she's not just metal. She's strength, she's movement, she's home for the moment. Above them, the captain walks the bridge with slow steps. He watches the horizon, black upon black, and listens to the ship's heart. There's a strange beauty in the emptiness, he thinks. No land, no light, only the quiet strength of the sea. He doesn't know that just beyond that still horizon, a shadow waits in silence. If your mind begins to wander, let it drift. You don't have to hold on tightly to every detail. Like the waves, thoughts can come and go. The calmness you feel now, that's the real story. The night the Titanic sailed through absolute peace, unaware that it was the last peace she would ever know. Inside one of the cabins, a young couple whispers softly before sleep. They talk about their plans in New York, their laughter gentle and tired. The woman says she feels the ship moving slower now. He smiles and tells her it's only the calm sea. They turn off the light. The world outside keeps its quiet watch. And as the clock strikes 11:40, the stars above shimmer brighter than ever. The ship moves forward into the dark, carried by her own certainty. The night is colder, the sea smoother, the silence deeper. For one last moment, the Titanic glides through the stillness of the world, a giant of steel and light sailing toward history, wrapped in the softest calm the ocean ever gave. Now, as you listen to the sound of this calm night, you can rest your thoughts. The story continues quietly beyond this moment, but for now, we stay here, in peace, in stillness, in the last breath of the night before everything changed. You can let go. You can rest. History will wait until morning. The morning after that still, quiet night began with a strange sense of pride and peace. The Titanic was more than a ship. It was a statement of what humanity could build. Every polished brass railing, every glowing light bulb, every echoing hallway seemed to whisper the same message. This vessel could not fail. People said it was unsinkable, and somehow everyone believed it. From the moment it left Southampton, the Titanic carried more than 2,000 souls across the Atlantic. Passengers, workers, dreamers. Some were rich beyond measure, others were searching for new beginnings. Yet all of them shared the same confidence, the same feeling that they were part of something extraordinary, something safe. In the upper decks, the air smelled faintly of salt and luxury. The carpets were soft, the chandeliers glowed like captured sunlight. Every detail was designed to remind its passengers that this ship was unlike any other. It was comfort on water, elegance in motion. People laughed, they dined, they strolled along the promenade, completely at ease. Below, the machinery hummed steadily, powerful, precise, and alive. The engineers and firemen worked tirelessly, feeding the great engines with coal, keeping the heart of the ship beating. They took pride in their work. To them, Titanic wasn't just a ship. It was a masterpiece of balance and order, a floating city powered by fire and faith in human skill. That faith was strong. Even the newspapers had called it virtually unsinkable. A phrase that comforted some and challenged others. But no one questioned it too deeply. After all, the world was changing fast. Humanity had conquered the sky, stretched steel across oceans, and lit up the night with electricity. Surely, the sea itself could be tamed too. Passengers spoke about it with admiration. "She's the safest ship ever built," one man said over breakfast, tapping his teacup with a smile. Another nodded, adding, "Even if she's damaged, she could float for days." The words drifted like smoke, soft and confident. They didn't know how heavy those same words would feel later, echoing back through time. Outside, the sea stretched endlessly, blue and calm beneath the morning sun. The wind carried the faint scent of salt and iron. The ship's white hull gleamed, catching the light like a moving star. From far away, she looked unstoppable, gliding across the horizon with elegance and power. Inside the wireless room, messages buzzed and tapped through the air, greetings from other ships, updates on weather, small talk across invisible lines. Technology felt like magic. The operators smiled, exchanging news with distant vessels. They could speak across oceans now. What could possibly go wrong when the world itself seemed so connected? By afternoon, passengers wandered the decks, wrapped in coats and conversation. Some read newspapers, others leaned over the railings, watching the water sparkle below. Children laughed as the cold wind brushed their faces. It all felt infinite, a moment in time that could never end. That sense of safety was almost intoxicating. As evening returned, the dining rooms glowed with soft amber light. Glasses clinked, silverware chimed, and the scent of warm bread and roasted meat filled the air. The band played quietly in the background, melodies of home and hope. The ship felt alive, and everyone aboard believed they were part of something eternal, though nothing in this world ever truly is. The captain walked the deck that evening, hands behind his back, his eyes calm. He had seen many voyages, many storms. But tonight, he felt at ease. The ship responded smoothly to every command. The engines purred, the course was clear, and the sea remained still. He looked out into the distance, a horizon so clean it felt empty. Deep below, a mechanic checked the water pumps, the pressure gauges, the steady heat of the furnaces. Everything read perfectly. The Titanic was performing better than anyone could have hoped. He took a slow breath, feeling proud. If only he knew how fragile perfection can be. The passengers in first class finished dinner and moved to the lounge for conversation. They spoke about politics, art, and the beauty of the ship itself. One woman ran her hand along the polished wood and said softly, "It feels like the world itself has been rebuilt on water." Her husband smiled, "And it will carry us safely to tomorrow." The glow from the lamps reflected off the glass, warm and steady. Outside those walls, the sky was growing darker, stars beginning to appear. No one noticed how quickly the temperature was dropping, or how the air had begun to sting against the skin. The sea was preparing its silence once more, and somewhere deep inside the ship, a quiet sound continued, the heartbeat of engines, steady and sure. The Titanic was strong, the people aboard were calm, and the world seemed perfectly balanced. It was the calm before understanding, the pride before humility, the peace before the ocean reminded humanity that even greatness must one day bow to nature. As night began to fall again, the ship's lights shimmered like floating stars upon the sea. From a distance, it must have looked almost unreal, a palace of gold gliding across black water. Inside, the warmth of conversation filled every corner. The laughter, the music, the soft rustle of fabric, it all blended into one steady heartbeat of human confidence. Up on the deck, the wind had turned colder. Breath became visible, and the sky deepened into velvet darkness. The stars seemed endless, mirrored perfectly by the glassy surface of the ocean. It was the kind of night sailors rarely see. No waves, no movement, no sound. The sea was unnaturally calm, so smooth that even the horizon disappeared. Some of the crew found that quiet unsettling. A few muttered about how strange it was for the Atlantic to be so still in April. But others brushed it off. After all, this was the Titanic, the finest, safest ship afloat. If any vessel could handle the unknown, it was this one. The idea of danger felt like a story from another time. Inside the second-class cabins, families read by lamplight, their children already asleep. A young man wrote a letter to his parents, describing how magnificent everything looked, the food, the service, the kindness of the crew. He paused, listening to the faint hum of the engines through the floorboards, steady and comforting. He smiled, sealing the envelope. Meanwhile, in third class, the atmosphere was simpler but no less joyful. A group of travelers played music on a fiddle, the melody bright and full of life. Others clapped along, tapping their feet against the wooden floor. Hope filled the air, the kind of hope only people chasing new beginnings can truly feel. It was a beautiful, innocent moment. Far above, the officers paced quietly, their boots clicking against the deck. They watched for changes in the sea or sky but found none. The temperature continued to fall, and frost began to form on the ropes and railings. Still, the ship pressed forward, cutting through the cold with grace. Every movement felt effortless. The chief engineer inspected the machinery one last time that evening. Everything ran perfectly. He could hear the steady rhythm of the pistons and turbines, the sound of precision, of progress. To him, that sound was reassuring, almost soothing. It was proof that human effort could bring order to chaos, even on a restless ocean. Around 9 p.m., a faint message arrived by wireless, another ship warning of ice ahead. The message was received but quickly set aside. There was no sense of urgency. The sea was calm, the sky was clear. Besides, Titanic's route had already been chosen. They would proceed as planned. After all, she was the ship the world trusted most. In the grand staircase, the lights glowed softly through the stained glass ceiling. Passengers passed by slowly, some in conversation, others simply admiring the beauty around them. A woman in a blue gown stopped at the landing and looked up, whispering how peaceful it all felt. Her companion nodded, smiling. Peace can be deceptive when it's too perfect. The orchestra played again in the first-class lounge. A gentle waltz filled the air, delicate, graceful. The musicians swayed slightly with the motion of the ship, their fingers precise and calm. The sound drifted through the corridors, blending with laughter and the clinking of glasses. It was a lullaby of luxury. Outside, a few passengers leaned over the rail, marveling at how the stars reflected on the sea's surface. One man said it felt like sailing through the night sky itself. Another agreed, adding that the stillness was almost eerie. But they stayed there anyway, unwilling to leave such beauty behind. If you listen closely now, in your imagination, you can almost hear it. The faint hum of engines, the soft murmur of the sea against steel, the quiet murmur of life aboard a ship that believed it could never fall. It's a kind of confidence that feels gentle in hindsight, but also fragile. Down below, in the mailroom, a clerk stacked letters with careful hands. He didn't know that in a few hours, those letters would sink to the bottom of the sea, unread. He only knew the satisfaction of order, of work done well. Sometimes, history hides in the smallest details, moments too ordinary to notice at the time. And still, the ship moved forward, steady and strong. The passengers began to sleep, one by one. The lights dimmed, the laughter faded, and a hush fell over the decks. The Titanic sailed into darkness, not in fear, but in peace. The belief in her strength was so deep, it silenced even the thought of doubt. The ocean remained calm. The stars continued to shine. Everything seemed eternal, though only Allah makes things truly everlasting. For now, all the world saw was light and steel gliding across the still water, a masterpiece of human creation, unaware that soon, the sea would remind everyone how small even the greatest works of humankind can be. The night deepened, and with it came a quiet chill that settled across the decks. The air had turned sharper now, the kind of cold that bites at the fingertips and turns breath into mist. The stars above seemed closer, clearer, like distant fires frozen in place. The Titanic moved forward through the darkness with quiet certainty, unaware that the sea had begun to whisper warnings no one could hear. Inside the wireless room, the operators were still at work, the faint tapping of Morse code echoing through the small space. Messages came and went, cheerful notes, greetings from other ships, and the occasional warning about drifting ice. One message mentioned a large field of ice directly in Titanic's path. But the night was calm, the sea too peaceful to believe such a thing could matter. The message was acknowledged, then set aside. Out on the bridge, the officers stood watch in silence. The sea looked endless, smooth, black, and strangely still. The kind of stillness that almost feels unnatural. No waves broke against the hull, no wind stirred the flags. The ship glided through the Atlantic like a shadow. The officers spoke quietly about the temperature. noting how the air felt colder than it had been all week. Frost began to form along the railings and ropes, glittering faintly under the lantern light. Each breath left a small cloud behind. The metal creaked softly in the freezing air, and somewhere out there, beyond the reach of human eyes, ice floated silently, waiting. But to those aboard, it was just another calm night. Below deck, the warmth of the engines created a different world. The workers, covered in sweat and soot, shoveled coal into glowing furnaces. The air was thick and hot, the sound of steam and metal constant. For them, the idea of cold felt distant, something happening far above their heads. They were the heartbeat of the ship, keeping her alive, unaware of the quiet danger surrounding her. Up in the crow's nest, two lookouts stood side by side, wrapped tightly in thick coats. They stamped their feet to keep warm, their breath visible in the freezing air. Their eyes scanned the horizon, searching for anything out of place. But without binoculars, they had only the stars and their instincts to guide them. The sea looked empty, black upon black. At times, they joked softly, their voices breaking the silence. But most of the time, they said nothing. The cold had a way of making silence heavier, as if the night itself was holding its breath. One of them rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the fatigue that comes from staring too long into darkness. The other leaned forward, squinting. The ocean gave nothing away. Back in the chart room, a few of the senior officers reviewed the ship's route. The reports about ice had been mentioned, but there was confidence that the Titanic's course was safe. They trusted their distance, their design, their speed. The sea was too calm, they thought, for any real threat. After all, the icebergs usually showed themselves long before they became a danger. The wireless operator, exhausted after hours of tapping out messages, leaned back in his chair. The room was warm, filled with the hum of electricity and static. Another warning came through, more urgent this time. But at that very moment, he was handling messages for passengers, personal notes, dinner invitations, bits of life carried through the air. He decided to finish those first. Time, after all, seemed endless. Out on deck, the cold intensified. The sea glimmered faintly in the starlight, smooth, reflective, unbroken. To some, it looked beautiful. To others, unnerving. A few passengers, wrapped in coats, stepped outside just to see the stars. They spoke quietly about how still the ocean was. One woman remarked that it looked like polished marble. Her companion smiled. "A perfect night," he said. Somewhere far ahead, the first edges of ice drifted unseen beneath the stars. Not enough to alarm, not enough to notice, just silent pieces of frozen sea carried slowly southward by unseen currents. The ocean had begun to change its tone, not with sound, but with presence. Still, no one aboard the Titanic could feel it. For those awake, the night felt endless, but comforting. The gentle vibration of the engines, the faint hum of electricity, the muffled rhythm of life on board, it was enough to make anyone forget the dangers of nature. The world outside the ship no longer felt like wilderness. It felt conquered. And perhaps that was the first mistake. If you're listening closely now, you can sense it, that quiet turning point in history where the calm is too complete, the peace too flawless. The kind of quiet that carries warning, even when no one hears it. It's not loud, not dramatic, just the slow, steady approach of something inevitable. And yet, even in this moment, the story remains peaceful. Because history, before it breaks, always moves gently, like water brushing against the side of a ship, whispering softly before it speaks. The hours crept forward. The ship continued at full speed, cutting through the still water as if nothing could stand in its way. On the bridge, the officers checked their instruments again, their movements calm and practiced. Everything looked perfect, the sea level, the bearings, the course. Nothing seemed unusual. Only the cold, deepening by the minute, hinted that the world outside was quietly changing. In the crow's nest, the lookout shifted from one foot to another, trying to fight the chill that had settled deep in their bones. Their faces were numb, their hands stiff. The metal rails glistened with frost, and the ropes around them had turned white. One lookout whispered that it felt colder than it should, even for the open sea. The other nodded, his eyes fixed on the dark ahead. Far below, the warmth of the furnaces filled the engine rooms. The firemen worked tirelessly, the glow of orange light painting their faces as they shoveled coal into the roaring flames. The sound was constant, a deep, rhythmic pulse that kept the Titanic alive. Above them, the cold sea pressed silently against the hull, as if testing its strength. The wireless operator finally paused his work to stretch. His ears rang from hours of tapping messages into the night. Another warning about ice had come in, clearer this time, from a nearby ship. But it was late, and the message would wait. He leaned back, closing his eyes for just a moment, unaware that this single decision would echo in history. On the deck, a faint mist of frost began to coat the surface. The lamps flickered softly, their light golden and warm against the freezing air. The world felt smaller now, surrounded by blackness and silence. The horizon had vanished. There was only the ship, floating in its own bubble of light, moving steadily into the unknown. Inside, most passengers were asleep. The corridors were quiet except for the occasional creak of wood and the hum of the engines. A steward walked through the hallway with a lantern, checking that everything was in order. The light from his lamp shimmered faintly against the polished brass. He stopped for a moment, listening. There was nothing, not even the sound of waves. Up in the crow's nest, one of the lookouts rubbed his eyes again. The cold made them water, blurring his vision. He squinted into the black ahead, scanning the faint shimmer of stars reflected on the sea. Suddenly, he blinked. Something didn't look right. The stars seemed to vanish in one small patch of darkness. He leaned forward, narrowing his gaze. At first, it looked like a shadow, a trick of the eyes. The ocean can play tricks when the night is too still. But this shape wasn't moving. It was fixed, solid, and pale against the darkness. The lookout felt a sudden jolt of recognition. Not fear yet, just awareness. He rang the warning bell once, then twice, then a third time. Down on the bridge, the officer on duty looked up sharply at the sound of the bell. The phone beside him rang almost instantly. "Iceberg right ahead," came the voice from above, calm but urgent. The officer stepped forward, instinct already taking over. He ordered, "Hard to starboard," his voice cutting through the still air. The helmsman gripped the wheel and turned with all his strength. For a moment, the ship continued straight. The movement of such a massive vessel was slow, deliberate. The engines roared as the crew worked to reverse them. The Titanic began to respond, turning, but not fast enough. The silence outside grew heavier, pressing down on everything like a held breath before impact. Up above, the iceberg loomed larger now, its jagged edge shining faintly under the stars. It wasn't tall and narrow like drawings would later show. It was wide, ancient, and silent. The sea around it was glassy, offering no sound of warning, no splash or wave. It waited, patient and cold. The lookout's breath caught in his chest. He couldn't look away. It was too late to shout again. The ship's bow moved slightly to the left, but the distance between steel and ice had already vanished. The first touch wasn't violent. It was almost soft, a low scrape, like stone dragging across silk. That sound echoed through the hull, faint but unmistakable. Some passengers felt a small vibration beneath their feet. Others didn't notice at all. The ship shuddered gently, then continued forward as if nothing had happened. The engines groaned, the lights flickered once, and the silence returned. On the bridge, the officers exchanged tense glances. They had no idea yet how deep the damage ran. One of them exhaled slowly, whispering a quiet hope that it was nothing serious. But far below, seawater was already rushing in, fast and unstoppable. The ocean had finally answered, not with fury, but with quiet power. And above it all, the stars kept shining, calm, distant, and cold. The ship continued forward, unaware that the stillness of the night had ended. The warning had been given, but too late. The sea had spoken in silence, and now the Titanic carried that silence within her steel heart. The crow's nest sat high above the deck, exposed to the night wind and the endless sky. It was a lonely place, reached by a narrow ladder and surrounded by cold iron rails. From there, the world seemed to disappear into blackness. No horizon, no difference between sky and sea. Only the faint reflection of the stars guided the eyes of the two men standing watch. Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee had been there for hours, faces red from the freezing wind. Their coats were heavy, but the cold still reached through the layers, biting at their fingers and cheeks. They shifted quietly, stamping their feet for warmth, taking turns scanning the sea ahead. Their eyes had adjusted to the darkness, though the world remained little more than a blur of shapes and shadows. The ship's faint hum rose from below, the steady rhythm of engines pushing through calm water. It was comforting in a strange way, a reminder that they were not alone, even in this endless dark. Fleet rubbed his gloved hands together, squinting toward the horizon. The stars above shimmered like silver dust scattered across the heavens. Everything else was still. They spoke very little. The night air made conversation slow and effortful. A few quiet words were exchanged now and then, small talk, fragments of thought. Lee muttered about how calm the sea looked tonight. Fleet nodded but said nothing. His breath came out in soft clouds, instantly fading into the night. From up there, the Titanic looked peaceful, her 4 great smokestacks rising into the starlight, her decks glowing faintly with warmth. She moved like something alive, graceful and unaware. Fleet watched the faint outlines of her forward deck disappear into darkness and wondered if those below could feel the cold as sharply as he did. He blinked, his eyes watering from the wind. The stars reflected on the sea's surface, making it hard to tell where the water ended. Sometimes it looked like they were sailing through the sky itself. The silence was almost complete. Even the usual creaks of the ship seemed to fade. It felt as though the entire world had paused to listen. Fleet didn't hesitate. He reached for the bell beside him and struck it 3 times, sharp and clear in the frozen air. Then he grabbed the phone and called down to the bridge. "Iceberg, right ahead." His voice was calm, but his heart was racing. Lee watched silently, his eyes locked on the growing shadow. Fleet felt a strange mix of awe and fear. The iceberg wasn't moving quickly, nor did it crash toward them. It simply waited, massive and indifferent. The Titanic's bow turned slightly, the movement graceful but inadequate. For one brief second, it seemed they might miss it. Then, with a sound like tearing fabric, steel met ice. Fleet leaned forward, squinting again into the darkness. The iceberg was already behind them, fading into the Black Sea. For a few seconds, he thought maybe they had escaped harm, that the sound had been nothing. But deep down, something felt wrong. The silence that followed was too complete. Below, the ship continued to move forward, slowing gradually. The ocean remained calm, as if the world hadn't noticed what had just happened. The stars shone brightly above, uncaring and cold. Fleet gripped the railing tightly, his breath quick and shallow. "I think we've struck her," he said softly. Lee nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think so too." For a moment, neither of the lookouts moved. They stood frozen in the bitter air, listening to the echo of that faint scrape fading into silence. No sound of panic, no shouting from below, only the steady hum of engines that still pulsed through the air like a heartbeat. The ship seemed alive, unaware that it had been wounded. Fleet lowered his hand slowly, the chill burning against his fingers. "Should we ring again?" he asked quietly. Lee shook his head. "They know now." Their words drifted away in the wind, soft as snow. Below them, they could see officers moving along the bridge, lanterns flickering like tiny sparks of gold against the dark. The cold pressed closer, sharper now, as if the sea itself had turned against the air. Fleet wiped frost from the railing and leaned forward once more, trying to catch sight of the iceberg behind them. It had already disappeared into the black, vanishing as quietly as it had appeared. Only the sound of the wind remained. On the bridge, the officers gathered, voices low and controlled. The captain arrived, his expression calm but focused. Orders were exchanged with quiet precision. He asked what they had struck, and the officer replied, "Iceberg, sir." The words carried easily through the air, clear and simple, but heavy with meaning. Fleet could see the officers below moving to the telegraphs, sending signals down to the engine room. The ship was slowing further now, turning slightly to a halt. Lanterns moved like fireflies across the deck as crewmen hurried to inspect the damage. Everything looked calm, but beneath that calm, something irreversible had begun. The two lookouts remained in their post, silent observers of the moment when history quietly shifted course. They could do nothing more now but watch. Fleet's hands trembled from the cold and something deeper, a sense that the silence below was not peace, but uncertainty. The wind whistled softly around the metal of the nest. Fleet glanced upward, then back toward the horizon. The stars were still there, untouched, unmoved. For a strange second, he felt a sense of disbelief, as though what had just happened wasn't real. How could a sound so soft mean anything at all? From far below, faint voices began to rise, muffled, distant. Crew members opening doors, checking compartments, asking quiet questions. The noise was subdued, almost polite. No alarm, no chaos, just the first ripples of realization spreading through the ship. Fleet rubbed his eyes, exhaustion settling in. His breath came out uneven, a pale mist that drifted away before he could see it fade. He thought of how the ship had looked earlier that evening, glowing, perfect, invincible. It was strange how quickly perfection could change its shape in the dark. Lee leaned against the rail, staring into the sea. "It's too quiet," he said under his breath. Fleet nodded. "Aye, too quiet." The ocean, so calm before, now felt like it was listening. Even the smallest movements seemed to echo. There was a weight in the air, not noise, not wind, just awareness. On the bridge, the captain ordered the watertight doors closed. The signal rang out through the corridors, a sound both metallic and final. Deep below, massive steel doors sealed with a dull thud. The Titanic, the great ship that was once called Unsinkable, was quietly locking itself against the sea. Fleet and Lee looked down, watching the movement of lights far beneath them. They couldn't see the water pouring in, couldn't hear it rushing through the ruptured hull, but something told them that the damage was real. The air around them felt heavier now, filled with the weight of understanding that would take time to reach everyone aboard. For the next few minutes, they stayed where they were. The duty wasn't over, and the night wasn't done. The cold grew sharper still, cutting through the fabric of their coats. The stars continued to burn above them, countless, bright, silent. Nothing had changed in the sky. Everything had changed below. And so, the lookouts remained at their post, alone, alert, and surrounded by the quiet vastness of the ocean. The ship beneath them began to shift almost imperceptibly, tilting by degrees too small to notice yet. But the night, once so calm and endless, had begun to move. The warning had been given, the impact made, and now history continued its quiet descent into the dark. The first sound was barely a sound at all. A soft scrape, low and distant, that rolled through the ship like a sigh. Many passengers didn't even wake. Those who did only stirred faintly, half asleep, wondering if they had dreamed it. The Titanic continued forward, her engines humming beneath the floor, her lights glowing steady and warm. On the bridge, the officers felt the vibration, gentle but unmistakable. They exchanged quick glances, their expressions calm yet focused. The helmsman still held the wheel, waiting for orders. The captain's boots echoed softly against the deck as he stepped toward the rail, looking out into the darkness. The iceberg was gone from sight, swallowed by the sea behind them. "Stop the engines," came the quiet order. The telegraphs rang out, the brass handles moving in unison. Deep below, the roar of machinery began to fade. The ship slowed, her massive weight gliding through still water until at last she drifted to silence. The only sounds that remained were the wind and the faint creak of steel cooling in the cold air. For a few long moments, nothing happened. The crew listened, waiting for something, a second jolt, a a sound of breaking, the rush of water. But there was only quiet. One officer exhaled and muttered that perhaps they had missed the worst of it. Another nodded, though his eyes stayed fixed on the Black Sea, calm on the surface, uncertain beneath. In the lower decks, a few passengers peeked out of their cabins. Some were laughing sleepily, others looked confused. A young boy asked his mother what the noise had been. She smiled gently and said it was probably nothing, maybe ice hitting the side. She tucked him back into bed and whispered that everything would be fine. Above them, the ship seemed perfectly calm. But in the mailroom, the sound was different, sharper, heavier. The clerks heard a distant rush, like wind moving through a tunnel. One of them turned toward the far wall and saw a thin stream of water sliding through the seam between rivets. It wasn't much, just a trickle, but it was icy cold, and it didn't stop. They stared at it for a moment before one whispered, "That's not supposed to happen." The watch engineer arrived moments later, lantern in hand. His light flickered across the floor, glinting on the spreading puddle. He touched the water, freezing, unmistakable seawater. Without a word, he turned and hurried toward the next compartment. As he opened the door, a deeper sound reached his ears, the hollow roar of water pouring in fast. Up on the bridge, the captain called for Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, who had been resting in his cabin. Andrews arrived quickly, still fastening his coat. He moved with quiet urgency, asking what had happened, where they had struck. The officer pointed toward the bow. "Forward starboard side. Feels minor, sir." Andrews nodded and went below. In the first-class corridors, passengers were beginning to step into the hallways, robes and slippers replacing gowns and uniforms. Their voices were calm, curious, almost amused. A few asked if it was true that they had hit something. One steward smiled politely and reassured them. Just precaution, nothing to worry about. The words sounded practiced, but his eyes told another story. In the boiler rooms, chaos had begun to stir. The first wave of seawater had reached the lower compartments, hissing as it met the heat of the furnaces. Steam filled the air, and men shouted over the noise. The watertight doors had been closed by the captain's order, sealing off sections of the ship. But the water was already spilling from one to the next, too quickly to stop. The engineers moved fast, their boots splashing through the rising flood. They slammed valves shut and checked gauges that now trembled under pressure. The noise was deafening, the groan of steel, the hiss of steam, the roar of the ocean forcing its way inside. One man stopped long enough to stare at the wall, watching it bend slightly under the force of water. He whispered to no one, "She's hurt bad." Above them, the passengers had no idea. The music in the lounge had stopped, replaced by quiet voices and uncertain smiles. The air felt colder now. Some noticed the slight tilt of the floor, but dismissed it as imagination. A few returned to their cabins, believing the night would resume as normal. After all, this was the Titanic, the ship that could not sink. If you were there, standing on the deck at that moment, you might not have felt anything unusual. The sea remained calm, the stars unchanged. The sound of water against the hull was soft, steady, almost peaceful. It didn't feel like disaster. It felt like nothing at all. And perhaps that was what made it so haunting, how quietly it began. Down in the bow, the water spread quickly, slipping through cracks and seams like a silent creature finding its way home. The sound was strange, not loud, not dramatic, just the soft rush of something inevitable. Crewmen ran with lanterns, their shadows flickering across the walls. They shouted for pumps, for tools, for help, but their voices were swallowed by the echo of the sea pressing in. Thomas Andrews arrived within minutes. His lantern light glowed against the flooding metal walls, reflecting off the surface of the water now knee-deep in places. He knelt, touched it, then looked up at the crew around him. His face was calm, almost unreadable, but his eyes told the truth. He already understood what the numbers would mean. He began moving from compartment to compartment, counting quietly to himself, noting how many were filling. 1, 2, 3, 4, then 5. The ship could stay afloat with 4 flooded. But not 5. He didn't say it yet, not aloud. Instead, he told the men to keep pumping and to close every door they could. He moved quickly, his footsteps echoing in the metallic corridors like distant drums. On the bridge, the captain waited for the report. The cold air bit at his face, his gloved hands resting on the railing. The sea looked calm as ever, smooth, endless, indifferent. He turned slightly when Andrews appeared beside him. Their conversation was quiet, just a few words exchanged, but they carried the weight of everything that would follow. "She's taking water fast," Andrews said softly. 5 compartments. The captain didn't speak right away. He looked out across the black ocean, then back at his ship, her lights glowing beautifully, her decks peaceful. "How long?" he asked at last. Andrews paused, his voice low. "An hour and a half, maybe 2. In that moment, time seemed to stop for them both. The truth settled silently between them, cold and absolute. The Titanic, the ship everyone believed could never sink, was dying beneath their feet. Not with thunder, not with flames, but with the quiet persistence of the sea. Orders began to move through the ship like whispers carried by the wind. "Wake the passengers. Ready the boats." The crew moved swiftly but calmly, their training guiding them. There was no shouting, no panic, just quiet urgency, the kind that comes when people know there's no use in fighting the truth, only in preparing for it. In the first-class cabins, stewards knocked gently on doors, their voices polite but firm. "Just a precaution. Please put on your life jacket and come on deck." Some passengers grumbled sleepily. Others obeyed, curious rather than afraid. They wrapped themselves in coats and shawls, still half asleep, unaware that this was not a drill. In second class, confusion grew. People opened their doors to see neighbors in life vests, unsure of what was happening. A few asked if they had really struck something. The answers were vague. Ice, maybe. It's nothing serious. Yet the tilt of the floor told another story, subtle but undeniable. Drinks on tables had begun to slide. Water in glasses trembled. In the boiler rooms, the men worked relentlessly, trying to keep the pumps running even as the water rose around them. They waded through the flood, their bodies shivering from cold and exhaustion. One engineer, his hands trembling, whispered a quiet prayer under his breath, not for salvation, but for time. Just a little more time. The ship groaned softly, a deep, aching sound that seemed to come from its very bones. It wasn't the noise of collapse, but of strain, metal flexing under pressure, wood creaking as the weight shifted. Above deck, those sounds barely reached the passengers. For them, the night still felt strangely calm. The stars shone bright, the air was still, and the ocean gave no sign of what was happening below. Some passengers even joked as they stood on deck, wrapped in blankets. "So this is an iceberg drill," one man laughed. A woman beside him smiled nervously. "I suppose it's better to be safe." Nearby, a crewman lowered the first lifeboat to the deck. The ropes squeaked softly in the cold air. In the wireless room, the operators began sending out distress calls. Their fingers tapped quickly over the telegraph keys, dots and dashes echoing into the night. "CQD. Come quick. We have struck an iceberg." The message traveled invisibly through the dark, crossing waves and distance. Somewhere out there, other ships would soon hear it. The captain stood once more on the bridge, looking over his ship, this great vessel now wounded, though still beautiful. The lights shimmered across the water, reflecting in the stillness like candles on glass. He felt the faint tilt beneath his boots and knew it would grow worse with time. The calmness of his face never broke, even as his thoughts grew heavier. Andrews remained below for a while longer, walking through the corridors, running his hands along the walls he had designed. He stopped at one point, listening to the sound of the water rushing through unseen seams. It was strange. He had spent years imagining this ship, every detail, every strength. Now, the ocean was tracing its way through all of it, line by line. Back on deck, the cold had deepened. The air felt sharper, and the stars seemed even brighter, as though the world above refused to change while the world below quietly unraveled. People gathered in small groups, talking softly, their breath visible in the air. The band had begun to play again, gentle music meant to calm. No one truly understood yet. Not the passengers, not even many of the crew. The Titanic was still upright, her decks still glowing with light. She didn't look like a ship in danger. She looked like she always had, steady, powerful, and alive. Only those deep inside her hull knew that the sea was already winning. If you were standing there, watching the calmness around you, you might have believed everything would be fine. The night was too beautiful to end badly, too still to break apart. But history doesn't always shout when it changes. Sometimes it whispers. And on that night, the whisper came from the sea. At first, the crew still believed the ship would hold. They had faith in her strength, in her design, in everything they had been told about what she could endure. To them, the Titanic was not just another vessel. She was a marvel, the pride of human skill. Even as cold seawater seeped into the lowest decks, most thought it was just another problem to fix, another challenge to manage before dawn. But deep down, a quiet unease began to grow. The engineers moved through the corridors with lanterns held high, their light dancing on the metal walls. The water shimmered beneath them, dark and restless. It wasn't just trickling anymore. It was rushing, pressing harder, finding every opening it could. The sound of it echoed through the hull, steady and relentless, like the ticking of a clock that no one could stop. Thomas Andrews stood near the mailroom, his face lit softly by the flicker of a lantern. Around him, crewmen worked furiously to keep the pumps going. Their boots splashed through the rising water as they carried tools, tightened valves, shouted brief instructions. Andrews said little. He only watched, counting the compartments again in his head, knowing the truth before he spoke it. When he finally turned toward the nearest officer, his voice was calm, too calm. "There's no stopping it now," he said quietly. "The damage runs too deep." The officer froze, his hand tightening around the railing. "She's going down." Andrews nodded once. Slowly, "Yes, but she will go." Up on the bridge, the captain waited for confirmation. The air had grown colder still, biting through layers of wool and leather. When Andrews appeared beside him, his expression told the story before his words did. The captain asked nothing at first. He simply watched the horizon, dark and endless, before asking softly, "How long?" Andrews' reply was barely a whisper. An hour and a half, maybe two. There was no panic, no raised voice. Only silence, heavy and unspoken. The captain nodded, then turned to his men. "Prepare the boats," he said. His tone was steady, his words deliberate. Around him, the crew began to move with a quiet urgency, not rushing, not shouting. They knew what those words meant, though few dared to say it aloud. Far below, the sound of the sea grew louder. It wasn't the crash of waves, but something more constant, the endless rush of water finding its place. The pumps were working, but they couldn't keep up. The ocean was patient, unhurried, unstoppable. It filled each space carefully, silently, as though it had all the time in the world. In the boiler rooms, the men were told to shut down the fires one by one. The glow that had filled those iron chambers began to fade. Darkness crept in as steam hissed from the cooling pipes. The air turned cold quickly, carrying the faint scent of metal and salt. One stoker paused, wiping sweat and seawater from his brow, and looked around at the others. "Feels wrong to stop her heart," he said quietly. No one answered. On the passenger decks, stewards moved quickly through the corridors, knocking softly on doors. They tried to sound calm, reassuring, but their voices carried a thin edge of tension. "Just a precaution," they said. "Please come to the boat deck." Some passengers obeyed immediately, sensing the unease beneath those polite smiles. Others laughed it off, refusing to leave their warm cabins. In the wireless room, the operators continued their work, tapping out distress signals into the night. "CQD. "Come quick. We have struck an iceberg." The room was filled with the soft crackle of static and the rhythmic tapping of keys. Outside the small window, the stars burned bright, their reflections shimmering on the calm black sea. The world looked unchanged, yet everything had begun to unravel. Above deck, the crew started uncovering the lifeboats. Their hands moved with practiced precision, loosening ropes and checking the lines. Frost coated the metal, making every movement slower. The sound of pulleys and cables echoed faintly in the cold air. Passengers began to gather nearby, wrapped in blankets and confusion. They asked quiet questions, and the crew answered with simple words that hid the truth. "Just safety measures, sir." Back near the bridge, the captain gave his next order in a voice that barely carried above the wind. "Send the women and children first." It was said calmly, as though it were routine, but everyone who heard it understood what it meant. That phrase, once spoken, could never be taken back. It marked the beginning of something final. For the crew, realization came not with fear, but with stillness. They moved as they had been trained to, focused, controlled, almost mechanical. Yet inside, each man felt the same quiet dread. They knew the sea was rising faster than hope could follow. The Titanic, proud and mighty, was beginning her slow surrender to the ocean. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it, the sound of the pumps, the creak of ropes, the distant murmur of voices trying to stay calm. It wasn't chaos yet. It was order trying to hold its shape. And within that order, the truth spread quietly from one deck to another. The ship that could not sink was already sinking. The truth began to move like a quiet current through the ship. From the lowest decks to the grand staircase, from the engine room to the bridge, everyone was beginning to feel it. The Titanic was no longer steady. The faint tilt, once barely noticeable, had become something you could sense when you walked. It wasn't much, just enough to make a lamp swing slightly or a glass slide an inch across a table. But it was real. In the officers' quarters, men whispered between their duties. Some kept their eyes fixed on their tasks, pretending it was routine. Others looked out toward the horizon, unwilling to speak what they knew. The sea was calm, yet it carried an authority that no one could question. It had claimed the balance, and the ship was obeying. Thomas Andrews moved silently through the first-class corridors, checking the bulkhead doors and water levels himself. A few passengers stopped him to ask what had happened. He smiled faintly, his voice calm. "It's best to put on your life jackets," he said, "just in case." He didn't mention the numbers. He didn't need to. There was something in his tone, gentle but certain, that made people obey. Below deck, the firemen worked until their boots were covered in icy water. The glow of the furnaces was nearly gone now, replaced by the cold hiss of the sea. One of them, a young man barely 20, looked up toward the ceiling and whispered, "She's slowing." The others didn't answer, but they all felt it too, the heartbeat of the ship growing weaker. Up on the deck, the crew began lowering the first lifeboats. Their movements were slow but deliberate. The ropes creaked softly, the metal fittings groaned under the weight. The passengers who gathered nearby still didn't understand the urgency. Some hesitated to get in, saying they'd rather wait. "The ship's safer," one woman murmured. "She can't sink." The crew didn't argue, they just continued their work. The captain moved among them quietly, his presence steady. He gave short instructions, his face unreadable. There was no shouting, no drama, only the slow rhythm of preparation. Every command carried a kind of respect, as though he were guiding the ship through her final duty. Those around him followed without question. Inside the wireless room, the operators continued sending out calls for help. Their hands ached from hours of work, but they didn't stop. Ships replied one by one, some too far away, some uncertain, all trying to understand. "We are sinking," one message finally read. The words felt heavy even in Morse code, as if the air itself slowed to hear them. In the lower decks, the crew tried to calm the passengers who had begun to gather, asking questions. The water was creeping higher now, cool against their feet. One steward held a lantern high, his voice trembling slightly as he said, "Up the stairs, please. Quickly now." A mother clutched her child, glancing once over her shoulder as they climbed. Behind her, the corridor lights flickered. The sounds inside the ship had changed. The mechanical hum was weaker now, mixed with new noises, the groan of bending metal, the slosh of water moving through unseen spaces, the distant clatter of luggage shifting in storage rooms. Each sound carried meaning. Each sound whispered that time was moving faster. Thomas Andrews stopped briefly in the smoking lounge. The room was quiet, almost peaceful. A few passengers sat calmly, refusing to believe what was happening. One man asked softly, "Is it true?" Andrews looked at him for a moment, then nodded once. "Yes, I'm afraid it is." The man didn't move. He simply looked down at his hands, tracing the rim of his glass. On the bridge, the officers continued their duties, though the lines on their faces had deepened. One of them turned toward the captain. "Should we stop the music, sir?" The captain shook his head. "Let it play." And so, the band continued, quiet, steady, filling the cold night with the faint comfort of sound. By now, the ship's bow had dipped low enough that water was brushing against the deck rails. The sea sparkled faintly under the starlight, beautiful and cruel all at once. The crew at the bow could see it rising, could hear it lapping softly at the steel. They worked faster, calling for more passengers, their breath clouding in the freezing air. Up near the lifeboats, a young sailor hesitated. He watched as people stepped into the small wooden craft, their faces pale but calm. Behind them, the Titanic's great shadow stretched across the sea, massive, still glowing with electric light. It seemed impossible that something so grand could be fading. "She looks fine," he whispered. Another man shook his head slowly. "She's not." Down below, the engineers stayed at their posts. They didn't stop working the pumps. The captain hadn't ordered them to leave, and none of them would until he did. The water was up to their waists now, cold enough to steal their breath. One of them looked up at a fellow worker and said quietly, "Keep it running. Maybe it'll buy them time." And he did, until the lights flickered again, and the sound of the pumps began to fade. The realization had spread to everyone now. The crew no longer spoke about what might happen. They knew. And yet, they continued, lowering boats, guiding passengers, shoveling coal, sending messages, doing what they could to hold back what couldn't be stopped. Not because they believed they could win, but because it was their duty to try. And in that effort, calm, quiet, unbroken, there was something deeply human. The sea had taken control, but the people aboard still moved with purpose. There was no anger, only acceptance, shaped by courage. The Titanic was sinking, but her crew had not surrendered. They simply worked in silence, against the cold, against the clock, against the endless ocean rising around them. As the truth spread across the decks, the ship began to feel like two different worlds at once, one quiet and graceful, another trembling beneath the surface. Above, the lights still shone warmly through the night air, and the music carried softly between the decks. Below, the sea was working patiently, flooding through steel and wood with the slow rhythm of inevitability. Passengers began to move, some guided gently by crew, others wandering on their own. There was confusion, yes, but not chaos. Not yet. Many believed this was still temporary, an inconvenience, a story to tell later. They wrapped themselves in blankets, speaking in low voices, some even smiling faintly as they waited. "They say it's just a precaution," one woman whispered to another. "It'll be over soon." In the first-class lounge, a group of men sat around a table, still dressed in their evening coats. One of them stirred his drink slowly, watching the ripples spread and tilt ever so slightly. "Feels like we are leaning," he said. Another laughed softly. "The ship? Impossible." The sound of the band drifted in through the open door, calm, polite, unwavering. Further down the deck, a young couple stood near the railing, their hands clasped tightly together. They had planned to start a new life when they reached America. The man tried to keep his voice light, assuring her that everything was fine. But his eyes darted toward the bow, where the light seemed lower than before. "It's just the cold," he said. "The air plays tricks on you." She nodded, even though she didn't quite believe him. Children were being carried in their parents' arms, wrapped in coats far too large for them. Their eyes were wide but not frightened. The adults around them still smiled, still spoke softly, still kept their fear hidden beneath calm tones. One little girl pointed toward the sky and said, "The stars look close tonight." Her father smiled faintly and whispered, "Maybe they're watching over us." In second class, passengers gathered in small groups, uncertain what to do. Some of them prayed quietly, their voices blending into the soft hum of the ship. Others packed a few belongings into bags, photographs, letters, trinkets, things that felt important in that moment, though they didn't know why. A woman took off her wedding ring and tucked it into her coat pocket. "Just in case," she murmured. Down in third class, the story felt different. The language barrier, the distance from the upper decks, it all made the truth slower to reach them. A few stewards rushed through the corridors, urging families to come up, but many didn't understand the words. They followed one another uncertainly, children holding hands, clutching small bundles of belongings. The hallways echoed with footsteps and whispers. A group of men in third class tried to find their way to the stairs leading upward, only to find gates locked. The rule was for order, not cruelty, but in that moment it felt impossible. They called for help, their voices muffled by the steel. One of the crew promised he'd return with a key. He meant it. But time, even then, was already slipping away. On the boat deck, the crew continued their quiet work. The ropes creaked as lifeboats swung slowly out over the side of the ship. Some passengers watched nervously. The idea of stepping into a small wooden boat, suspended above an endless sea, seemed more dangerous than staying where they were. "We'll wait," one man said firmly. "This ship is safer than any rowboat." The irony of that sentence would only be clear much later. The officers tried to persuade them gently. "Please, ladies, step in. It's only a precaution." A few obeyed. Most hesitated. Even as the ship listed slightly forward, even as the cold wind grew harsher, belief in the Titanic's strength still held. People trusted her, perhaps more than they trusted the ocean itself. Far below, the water had reached new levels. The mail room was gone, the crew cabins filling quickly. The sea poured in without mercy, yet still without sound. It moved like a shadow, unhurried but certain. The men working there no longer shouted. They simply looked at each other with quiet understanding. "It's done," one said. The other nodded, then turned back toward the pumps. Up above, a faint note from the band drifted across the cold air. Alexander's ragtime band, cheerful and familiar. The sound was strangely comforting, almost absurd in contrast to what was happening below. But that music held people together. It gave shape to the calm, gave rhythm to the waiting. For some, it was a reminder of home. For others, it was a promise that there was still time left. If you were standing there on deck, wrapped in the cold, listening to that music, you might not have known what to feel. The air was sharp, the stars breathtaking, the ocean smooth as glass. Nothing looked like danger. And yet, deep inside, something in the stillness began to change. A quiet awareness, heavy and invisible, that the night had turned. As the minutes slipped by, the calm on deck began to shift. The air had turned sharper, the wind colder. Passengers started to notice the ships tilt more clearly now, the forward deck dipping lower toward the sea. Conversations grew quieter, eyes glanced downward. The illusion of safety was fading, replaced by something harder to describe. Not fear exactly, but understanding. The band kept playing. Their instruments trembled in the cold, fingers stiff, breath visible in the air. They moved from bright tunes to gentler ones, softer, slower. The sound traveled across the open water, echoing faintly between the lifeboats. For many, that music was an anchor, proof that order still existed, that calm could still hold. A mother tried to distract her child by pointing toward the lights of the ship's reflection on the water. "See how pretty it is," she whispered. The child nodded, sleepy, unaware that those reflections would soon vanish. The mother's eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, the stars shining so close they looked like lanterns hung by unseen hands. Near the stern, a small group of men lit cigarettes and stood quietly, their faces calm. One of them said he'd wait until the last boat, that there was time. Another nodded. "We'll be fine." The tone wasn't arrogant. It was hopeful, the kind of hope that people cling to when the truth feels too heavy. Crew members moved between them, guiding passengers to the lifeboats, reassuring as best they could. They spoke with practiced politeness, never raising their voices. But the weariness showed in their eyes. Every rope they touched, every life jacket they handed over, was an admission they didn't want to make, that this great ship was dying. A few passengers offered to help. Some men carried children to the boats, others helped the elderly across the slippery deck. The air was so cold now that each breath came out as white mist. Their movements were slow, careful. The sound of boots against the deck mixed with the steady creak of ropes and the distant hum of engines still turning, still refusing to go silent. Inside, in the warmth of the cabins, some refused to leave. A wealthy couple sat side by side on the bed, holding hands, too old to fight the cold, too tired to fear. "We've had our years," the woman said softly. Her husband nodded, squeezing her hand. They stayed where they were, listening to the faint music through the walls. In third class, people were finally being guided upward in larger groups. Some carried children wrapped in blankets. Others clutched whatever belongings they could save. Their faces were pale but steady. Many didn't speak. The sound of footsteps on the narrow stairs filled the hallways like rainfall, constant and rhythmic. They didn't yet know what awaited them above: the open air, the cold, and the stars staring back. On the bridge, the officers continued their quiet coordination. They called out orders in short, deliberate tones. The captain stood still, watching as another boat was lowered into the darkness. The ocean reflected the lanterns like shards of gold, each one fading quickly as the boat drifted away. He exhaled once, the cold catching in his throat, and turned toward the next. There was no chaos, no shouting, just movement, slow, deliberate, human. Every person on that deck was caught between hope and disbelief. Even as the boat dipped lower, even as the sea climbed the hull, there was still a strange dignity in it all. People helped one another, spoke gently, offered coats and scarves to strangers. The ship was sinking, but the people aboard had not lost their grace. Somewhere near the grand staircase, a young steward leaned against the railing, watching the chandelier sway gently with the ship's motion. He had seen it polished earlier that day, the crystals shining in the afternoon sun. Now, it glimmered faintly in the dim light, beautiful even as the floor beneath it tilted. He whispered quietly to himself, "She's going down," as if saying it softly could make it less true. Out on the open deck, the band had begun to play hymns now. The sound was slow and deep, carrying over the wind. It wasn't loud. It didn't try to compete with the sea. It simply existed, a small, fragile act of comfort. Some people cried quietly. Others smiled through their tears, grateful for something familiar to hold onto in the cold. Near one of the boats, a sailor handed a child to her mother, his hand shaking from the cold. "Hold her close," he said. "Keep her warm." The mother nodded, whispering a quiet thank you. The sailor turned away quickly, not trusting his voice to answer. He went back to the ropes, his breath heavy, his eyes on the water below. By now, the bow was deep in shadow. The lights still burned along the upper decks, but the lower ones were dimming as the water claimed them. The tilt had grown more obvious, enough that people had to steady themselves as they walked. Still, there was no panic, only a slow acceptance settling over everyone. If you were there, standing beneath that silent sky, you might have felt the strange calm that comes when there's nothing left to do but face what's coming. The sea was black and endless, the air cold enough to sting the lungs. And yet, there was beauty in that stillness, in the way people held each other, spoke softly, and waited together beneath the stars. The Titanic continued to sink, but she did so in silence, surrounded by calm faces and gentle voices. The ocean rose steadily, the music continued, and the night carried on, quiet, unbroken, and deeply human. The world was changing forever, but in that moment, it felt like time had slowed just to let them say goodbye with grace. The first lifeboat touched the sea with a soft splash, barely noticed against the stillness of the Atlantic. The ropes creaked, the wood groaned, and for a moment, everything stopped, even the wind. The small boat drifted gently away from the Titanic's side, its lantern swinging like a fragile star in the darkness. Above, the ship still glowed with light, towering and magnificent, as if refusing to admit what was happening. On the deck, the crew worked quietly, voices low, movements practiced. Each boat had to be prepared, checked, lowered by hand. The cold made the ropes stiff and the pulley slow. Frost bit at their fingers, yet no one complained. They just kept moving, methodical, calm, steady. Every life lowered into the dark water felt like a quiet promise to save what could still be saved. Many passengers hesitated at the edge of the boats. The idea of stepping off that massive, glowing ship into a small, wooden craft felt wrong, unsafe, even absurd. "Surely we'll be fine here," one man said softly, clutching his wife's arm. "She's the Titanic." The officer beside them nodded politely but urged again. "Ladies first, please." His voice trembled slightly, not from fear, but from cold and the weight of duty. Some women refused to leave their husbands behind. "If he stays, I stay," one said firmly, clutching his hand. Another tried to convince her, whispering, "It's only for now. They'll come after us." But even as she said it, she wasn't sure she believed it. The ship tilted ever so slightly beneath their feet, a silent reminder that time was already slipping away. A child began to cry softly, the sound cutting through the cold. Her mother lifted her into her arms, whispering words of comfort that vanished into the wind. When it was their turn, the sailor helped them into the boat, his hands trembling as he guided them down the rope line. "You'll be all right," he said quietly. "Keep her close." The mother nodded, eyes glistening in the lantern light. The band played on, the notes faint but steady. The melody floated through the air like a lullaby, drifting between the lifeboats and the sea. It was a strange kind of beauty, the sound of calm in the middle of tragedy. Some passengers paused to listen before stepping into the boats. For a brief moment, it made them forget the fear, reminding them that there was still grace left in the world. Thomas Andrews moved quietly among the passengers, adjusting life jackets, offering instructions. His voice was calm, his movements precise. When a steward asked if there was still hope, Andrews didn't answer. He only placed a hand on the man's shoulder and nodded toward the next group waiting to board. He seemed to understand something no one else could fully grasp, that saving even a few lives was a mercy worth everything. Each time a lifeboat was lowered, a hush fell over the deck. People watched in silence as it descended, rocking slightly as it touched the water. The faint creak of the ropes echoed like a heartbeat in the frozen air. Some called out softly to those inside, promising to follow in the next boat. Others said nothing at all, just watched as the distance grew between them. In the wireless room, the operators continued to send distress signals. Their fingers were numb, their backs aching from hours of work. But they kept going. SOS. They tapped out now, a newer signal, clearer, more desperate. Come quick. Coordinates attached. Ships responded from far away, some turning toward them, others too distant to arrive in time. Still, they kept sending, as though the sound itself could hold the night back. Below deck, the last of the engineers were still at their posts. The water was up to their chests now, freezing, relentless. They worked in silence, tightening valves, holding the pressure where they could. The lights flickered above them, glowing dimly in the rising water. One of them looked upward and whispered, "At least they'll have power until the end." Then he went back to work, his movements slow but sure. On the deck, the officers urged the next group forward. The crowd had grown thicker, the whispers louder. The ship's tilt was now impossible to ignore. A few passengers stumbled as they walked, grabbing onto railings to steady themselves. The crew's lanterns flickered in the wind, throwing long shadows across the deck. The glow of the ship's lights reflected on the black water below, perfect and fragile. For those who stayed behind, the sound of the lifeboats pulling away was haunting, the slow rhythm of oars cutting through calm water, the faint calls between boats. The ship that had once felt alive and invincible now seemed to watch them go, her lights glimmering like tears against the dark. If you were standing there, you might have felt something impossible to name: sorrow, disbelief, and yet peace. There was no storm, no violence, just the quiet separation of ship and sea, life and memory. The Titanic was still beautiful, still glowing in the cold, still holding on to dignity even as the ocean rose to claim her. The night grew colder, sharper, and quieter. The first lifeboats floated farther away, their lanterns now faint dots of light across the dark water. From the deck, they looked like stars that had fallen from the sky, flickering softly on the surface of the sea. Each boat carried whispers, small cries, and the sound of wooden oars cutting through the stillness. But from the Titanic, it was all distant, muffled by space, swallowed by night. Back on board, the officers continued their steady work. Their breath came in small clouds as they moved from one lifeboat station to the next. The ropes creaked, the pulleys groaned, and every launch took longer than the last. The cold stiffened their hands. Frost had begun to form on their coats. Still, they said nothing of pain. Their duty gave them warmth enough to keep going. Some passengers still refused to leave. They stood near the railings, wrapped in blankets and disbelief. "We are safer here," one man insisted, staring at the boats below. "This ship won't sink." A sailor glanced at him but didn't argue. He had no words left to change such certainty. He simply moved on to help someone else. The man stayed where he was, watching as another boat slipped away into the darkness. A group of women stood in line, waiting their turn, their faces pale in the lantern light. Some held hands, others clutched family photographs or letters. One woman whispered to the officer beside her, "Will my husband be allowed?" The officer hesitated, then shook his head gently. "Women and children first." She didn't cry. She only nodded, kissed her husband's cheek, and stepped into the boat without looking back. On the starboard side, the sound of a baby crying carried through the air. A young mother tried to calm her child as sailors adjusted the ropes. "You'll be all right," one said softly. His words were kind, though his voice broke halfway through. When the boat began to lower, the baby's cries grew fainter, blending with the sound of water brushing against the hull. Further along the deck, Thomas Andrews moved from boat to boat, checking the lines, giving instructions. A steward stopped him and asked, "Aren't you going, sir?" Andrews looked at him and smiled faintly. "No," he said. "There's still work to do." Then he turned back to his task, helping another passenger with her life jacket. The tilt of the ship grew more visible now. Walking required effort. People leaned into the angle as they crossed the deck. The music still played, though softer now, the instruments faint and tired. It was no longer for entertainment. It was for comfort. A few stopped to listen, closing their eyes for a moment as if to memorize the sound. The air was freezing. Ice crystals formed on the railings, glittering in the lamplight. Passengers' breaths turned to mist with every word. The sea below was still smooth, hauntingly calm, as if the ocean itself was holding its breath. The lifeboats, once close, were now specks fading into the distance. Inside, a steward guided the last few women from the first-class cabins toward the deck. The carpets were wet in some places, the air colder than it had ever been inside the ship. A woman in a fur coat paused at the doorway, glancing back down the corridor as though expecting someone to follow. But no one did. She stepped forward, her heels clicking softly on the wooden floor, each sound echoing like a farewell. Near the bridge, the captain watched the progress in silence. The water had reached the lowest level of the deck below. He could hear it now, not as a roar, but as a constant rush, like breath drawn by the sea. His officers looked to him for instruction, but he said little. He didn't need to. They knew what to do. The last boats on the port side were being filled. The crowd had grown smaller, quieter. The air was heavy with acceptance now. People no longer asked questions. They simply waited, listening to the creaks of the ship and the faint hum of the band. Time seemed to stretch, each minute longer than the one before. When one of the final boats began to lower, a man stepped forward suddenly, trying to follow his wife. The officer stopped him, hand outstretched. For a moment, they locked eyes. Then the man stepped back without protest. He removed his hat and nodded once in gratitude before turning toward the rail. There were no arguments anymore, only silence. In the lifeboats below, those already adrift turned their gaze back to the Titanic. The sight was breathtaking, terrible and beautiful at once. The ship's bow was deep in shadow now, but the upper deck still shone bright, glowing against the black sky. The lights shimmered across the water, trembling with the reflection of waves that hadn't existed an hour before. If you imagine yourself in one of those small boats, wrapped in the cold, watching from afar, you would see something that felt impossible. A giant of steel and light leaning quietly into the dark, the sound of faint music still reaching your ears. The sea was vast, the stars motionless, and the ship, once so proud, now looked fragile. And yet, it remained graceful, refusing to collapse into chaos, holding on to silence until the very end. Back on deck, a final lifeboat creaked as it descended, its ropes groaning under the strain. The officer called out one last time for women and children. His voice cracked and low. No one answered. He glanced toward the bridge, where the captain still stood motionless, and then toward the bow, where the sea waited patiently. The air felt heavy, too heavy for words. And so, the last of the boats drifted away, their lanterns swaying softly over the calm water. The people left behind stood in the glow of the ship's fading light, some holding hands, others standing alone. No one spoke. No one screamed. Only the sea moved, slow and certain, as the distance between the living and the waiting world began to widen. The sea had grown eerily quiet again. The lifeboats were gone now, scattered like faint constellations across the dark water. From them, the survivors watched in silence as the Titanic, still glowing with light, stood tall against the horizon. She looked almost peaceful, as though resting rather than sinking. The music still played, faint and unwavering, drifting across the cold air like a final lullaby. On board, the deck was tilting sharply now. People moved slowly, carefully, clinging to railings and ropes to keep their balance. The air was so cold that breath froze in the lungs. Frost covered every metal surface, glinting under the electric lamps that still burned with steady light. The ship creaked deeply, a sound that carried through every level, a groan that came not from fear, but from surrender. Near the grand staircase, Thomas Andrews stood motionless, his eyes tracing the curved banisters and the chandelier swaying softly overhead. Water had begun to creep along the floor below, shimmering like glass. He rested one hand on the wood he had once chosen himself and whispered something only he could hear. He did not run, did not panic. He simply remained, calm and still, as if keeping watch over what he had built. On the bridge, the captain looked out over the ocean one last time. The water had reached the deck below him now, and he could hear it surging through the corridors like a distant wind. His face was pale in the lantern light, but his posture remained firm. He had made his choice long ago, to stay with his ship. There was no speech, no final command, just silence. The band had moved closer together, huddled against the cold. Their instruments were shaking in their hands, yet they kept playing. The sound was fragile now, each note barely audible over the deep hum of the ship. One of them looked up at the sky and whispered a quiet prayer, not asking for rescue, but for peace. They ended one song and began another, something slower, softer, meant to comfort the living. Passengers clung to what stability they could find. Some gathered near the stern, helping one another keep their footing as the deck tilted more steeply. Others sat quietly on benches, their faces turned upward toward the stars. There were no more reassurances now. No one said, "It's fine," or "We'll be rescued soon." The truth was visible in every eye. This night would not end as they had once imagined. The air grew heavy with sound, the low rumble of shifting steel, the soft hiss of rising water, the faint cries of those calling out across the ship. Still, there was an eerie sense of order. People moved slowly, carefully. Some held hands, others embraced, whispering words that disappeared into the cold wind. It wasn't chaos. It was something quieter, almost reverent. From the lifeboats below, those watching saw the Titanic's bow sink lower, the stern rising high above the water. It was a sight almost too vast to comprehend. The ship seemed suspended between sea and sky, glowing with all its lights still burning bright. For a few moments, it looked like she might stay there forever, unmoving, beautiful, defiant against the dark. A few voices cried out, small and human against the endless sea. One woman in a lifeboat covered her ears. Another whispered, "They're singing." But the sound wasn't song. It was the deep, moaning rhythm of the ship's final breath, the last echoes of air escaping from her hull. Then, the lights flickered once, twice, and dimmed. The stars became the only light left. Inside, near the lower decks, the last of the crew worked until the water reached their chests. The pumps were gone, the fires extinguished. One man looked up at the ceiling as it groaned above him and whispered, "That's it." The sea answered with silence. He closed his eyes, letting the cold surround him, and in that quiet moment, the noise of the ship faded away. Above, people began to climb toward the stern, drawn by instinct, by hope. The tilt was steep now, impossible to ignore. Men and women helped each other along the rails, their feet slipping on the frost-covered wood. Some paused to look back one last time at the lights of the lifeboats far away, flickering faintly like candles in the dark. If you were there, standing in that frozen wind, you might have felt a strange calm settle over everything. The sound of the ocean grew louder, but the fear had quieted. The night sky stretched endlessly overhead, filled with silent stars that seemed to watch without judgment. It was as if the world itself had paused, holding its breath as the great ship prepared to let go. And in that stillness, as the water reached the last decks and the music faded, there was a feeling that cannot quite be described. Not panic, not surrender, but a quiet acceptance. The Titanic, once the pride of human achievement, now stood as a reminder of how small even the greatest creations are beside the sea. The ship's stern rose higher now, its black hull towering against the stars. People clung to the railings, their breath visible in the cold. The air was filled with small, fragile sounds, the creak of wood, the clatter of loose objects sliding down the deck, the quiet rush of the sea claiming its place. Yet even here, at the edge of disaster, there was still a strange calm. The cries that came were not wild. They were human, soft, and finite, like the wind moving through distant hills. Down below, the bow had vanished completely. The sea swallowed it without sound, taking it piece by piece. The water shimmered faintly with the reflection of the ship's remaining lights, glowing gold against blackness. It was hard to tell where the ocean ended and the ship began, both moving together now, slowly, inevitably, toward silence. Near the stern, people knelt together in quiet groups. Some prayed under their breath, others simply bowed their heads, their lips trembling with the cold. A young man removed his coat and placed it around a woman's shoulders, saying nothing. She looked at him, eyes wide, as if words no longer had meaning. Around them, the deck groaned softly, tilting more with every passing minute. Thomas Andrews was seen one last time near the first-class smoking room. The lights flickered above him as he stood alone, his hands resting on the back of a chair. The water crept closer, glimmering faintly under the lamps. He didn't move. He simply stared forward, as though memorizing the world before it vanished. To those who saw him, he looked peaceful, a man who understood the sea's power and no longer resisted it. On the bridge, the captain stood in the shadows. The water was only moments away now. Some said he remained there until the end, gazing toward the horizon as the ship beneath him trembled. He had guided ships across every kind of ocean, but this was different. There was nothing to command anymore, no orders left to give. Only stillness. The band played until the very last possible moment. Their music was no longer bright. It had turned into something almost holy in its calmness, not a hymn of faith, but of comfort. The notes drifted upward, mingling with the cold air, reaching the lifeboats still floating far away. Many survivors would later say that this was what they remembered most, the sound of that music, soft and steady, even as the world fell apart around it. The ship tilted sharply now, the angle almost impossible. People clung to the railings, to one another, to whatever they could find. Some began to slip, the icy deck offering no grip. The sound of breaking glass and falling furniture echoed faintly through the night, small reminders that gravity was changing, that the world itself had tilted. For a few seconds, the Titanic seemed to pause, frozen between balance and collapse. The lights flickered once more, glowing dimly, then went out completely. Darkness swallowed the decks. The only illumination came from the stars above and the faint glow of the sea below. In that instant, the ship became a silhouette against the heavens, vast and silent. Then came a deep, drawn-out sound, a low groan, as if the earth itself were sighing. The stern began to rise higher, water rushing over the decks in sheets of black glass. People shouted now, not in panic, but in desperation, calling names that vanished into the wind. The ship shuddered once, twice, and then broke the surface apart as the final section slipped beneath the waves. From the lifeboats, those watching saw it all, the great ship glowing one last time as she disappeared beneath the surface. The sound was enormous and yet somehow distant, muted by the cold and the night. The sea erupted briefly with foam and fragments, then settled again into stillness, as if nothing had ever been there. The place where she had stood moments ago was now only dark water, rippling softly under the stars. And then came silence. The kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, but full of memory, full of voices that had faded only seconds before. The ocean moved slowly, reclaiming its calm. The wind eased. Even the stars seemed to hold still. In the lifeboats, people stared at the horizon, too stunned to speak. Only the sound of gentle waves lapping against wood broke the quiet. The survivors sat huddled together, wrapped in blankets and disbelief. Some cried softly, others stared ahead in silence, as though still expecting to see the ship rise again. But she was gone, taken by the same sea that had carried her so proudly. The water around them shimmered faintly with pieces of wood, paper, and drifting light. It was beautiful and terrible all at once, the final reflection of a story already slipping into history. If you were there, floating in that cold stillness, you might have felt something beyond words, sorrow, or maybe even peace. The ocean had fallen quiet again, the stars unchanged, the air perfectly still. The Titanic, the ship once called Unsinkable, had vanished beneath the same sky she had left days before, and the night, vast and endless, went on as though it had simply witnessed another part of the sea returning home. When morning finally came, it did not announce itself with warmth or color. The first light of dawn rose quietly over the horizon, pale and cold, spreading across an ocean that was no longer calm but eerily still. The sky shifted from black to gray, the stars fading one by one until only the soft glow of day remained. The sea stretched endlessly in every direction, silent and empty, except for the small clusters of lifeboats drifting together in the distance. The survivors sat huddled close, wrapped in blankets stiff with frost. Their breaths came in slow, visible clouds. The cold was sharper now that the adrenaline had gone. Around them, the ocean moved gently, its waves small and rhythmic, as if nothing had happened at all. The only sounds were the creak of wood and the faint lapping of water against the sides of the boats. It was the kind of quiet that came not from peace, but from exhaustion. Some of the lifeboats had drifted close enough for people to call softly to one another. "Are you all right?" came a voice across the water, thin and trembling. "Yes," another answered, though neither voice carried the strength of certainty. They spoke as though testing the reality of their survival, unsure if it was relief or disbelief that filled their lungs. In one of the boats, a mother held her child close beneath a coat. The little girl slept, her face pale against her mother's shoulder. The woman stared out at the horizon, her eyes unfocused. Every now and then she looked behind her, as if expecting to see the ship, to see something, but there was only water. The space where the Titanic had once been was just an empty shimmer beneath the morning light. The air was calm now, without wind or motion. Pieces of debris floated by, fragments of wood, bits of furniture, a single glove. The water caught the pale sunlight, reflecting it in broken patterns across the survivors' faces. Each reflection was brief, like memory itself, here for a moment, then gone. No one spoke about what they had seen. It was too large, too heavy to fit into words. Some of the men in the boats tried to row, though their hands were stiff from the cold. The oars dipped into the sea with quiet rhythm, small ripples trailing behind. They weren't rowing toward anything in particular, only to move, to stay awake, to feel alive. The effort gave them purpose, even as they drifted through the endless grey. A few whispered prayers rose among them, soft and uneven. They weren't the grand, formal prayers of ceremony, but the quiet kind, words spoken between breaths, between shivers. Each one was different, shaped by the person who spoke it. Some prayed for rescue, some for peace, and others simply said thank you for the breath still in their lungs. The sky grew brighter by the minute, the color of dull silver. The light stretched across the lifeboats, revealing faces that had gone pale from cold and fear. There were tears on some cheeks, frozen in thin lines. A sailor in one of the boats adjusted his cap and looked out over the sea. "It's gone," he said quietly. No one answered. They all knew he wasn't just talking about the ship. Out on the horizon, a faint plume of smoke appeared, small, dark, rising steadily into the light. Someone pointed toward it, their voice weak but urgent. "A ship," they whispered. Heads turned, eyes squinting against the morning glare. It was far away, barely more than a shadow at first, but it was moving closer. The Carpathia. The name spread quietly from boat to boat like a fragile spark of hope. For the first time in hours, people began to speak with purpose. Some straightened up, others waved bits of cloth or raised their arms. The sailors shouted directions, trying to pull the boats together. Hope, cautious and trembling, returned to the air. It didn't erase the grief, it simply sat beside it, small and humble, but real. As the rescue ship drew nearer, its dark hull rising slowly from the horizon, the survivors could hear faint sounds again, the call of voices, the thud of oars, the low hum of engines. After hours of silence, the noise felt almost strange, like waking from a long dream. A few people began to cry quietly, their tears turning to frost as they fell. Others sat still, too tired even for relief. If you imagine yourself in one of those boats, you might feel the same mixture of emotions: sorrow for what was gone, gratitude for what remained. The ocean still stretched endlessly, but it no longer felt empty. The sun had begun to rise higher now, turning the water from grey to pale gold. The light touched every face gently, as if to remind them that morning had come, whether they were ready or not. As the Carpathia approached, her hull loomed like a shadow of salvation against the pale horizon. The survivors watched in silence, some holding hands, others too weak to lift their heads. The ocean that had taken everything now seemed to cradle them gently, as if its fury had passed. The sound of oars echoed faintly across the still water, each stroke bringing them closer to safety. When the rescue crew began pulling lifeboats alongside the ship, the quiet broke. Voices rose, not loud, but alive. A sailor reached down, calling softly, "You're safe now. Take my hand." Frozen fingers grasped his, one after another. One by one, they climbed up the ladders, carried by tired arms and careful hearts. There were no cheers, no shouts of victory, only relief, heavy and fragile, settling over everyone like a blanket. On deck, blankets and hot drinks were waiting, though warmth came slowly. The air was filled with the sound of coughing, quiet crying, and the soft murmur of gratitude. The crew of the Carpathia moved gently among them, helping where they could, listening when there were no words left to speak. The survivors looked back toward the horizon, where the Titanic had vanished. Only the sea remained, endless, cold, and calm. Some stood near the rail, staring into that emptiness. They searched for something, though they didn't know what. Maybe the place where the lights had last been, maybe the sound of the band that had once played. But there was nothing to see. The ocean had covered its secret, leaving only ripples and silence behind. Thomas Andrews, the captain, the engineers, the musicians, their names passed quietly among those rescued. Each time a name was spoken, it carried a weight. People bowed their heads, some whispered prayers, others simply watched the sea. There was no ceremony, no speech, only memory, and the sound of the waves brushing gently against the side of the ship. As the Carpathia turned south, away from the icy fields that had ended the Titanic's journey, the survivors began to feel the faint rhythm of movement again. The engines hummed softly, and the wind stirred for the first time that morning. It was a different sound now, not one of despair, but of continuation. The world had changed, yet it moved forward quietly, respectfully, as though mourning with them. Children slept wrapped in coats. Mothers kept their arms around them, unwilling to let go. Some passengers stared out at the sea for hours, unable to look away. Others closed their eyes and tried to rest, though the sound of water still filled their minds. Every wave felt like a memory returning. The laughter from the decks, the glow of the lamps, the hum of the engines before the night went silent. Later, as the sun rose higher, a soft golden light spread across the sea. It touched the faces of those who had survived, warming them just enough to remind them that life was still theirs to hold. The color of the ocean shifted from black to blue, deep and endless once again. The morning felt fragile, but alive. In the distance, the icebergs still floated, pale, enormous, unmoving. They glimmered beneath the sunlight like monuments to the night before. The survivors didn't look at them for long. Some whispered quietly, "Let's not speak of it yet." And they didn't. Not because they wanted to forget, but because the memory was still too near, too sacred to disturb. By the afternoon, the sea was calm again, as if nothing had ever happened. The Carpathia continued her slow, steady course toward New York. Behind them, the ocean shimmered with the quiet dignity of something eternal, not cruel, but powerful. It had taken, and it had spared. It was the same sea that carried them forward now, back toward the living world. Those who survived would carry the sound of that night forever, the music, the whispers, the stillness. The world would change because of what happened here, but not today. Today, there was only the sea, the sky, and the soft hum of the ship that had come to save them. And as the sun began to fade once more, turning the horizon gold and grey, the survivors sat quietly together. Some spoke in low tones, others closed their eyes. The day had been long, and the grief too deep for words. Yet within that silence, there was a small, steady comfort. They were alive, and morning had come. If you were to look at that ocean now, you would never know what had happened beneath it. The sea hides its stories well, but somewhere, within its depths and within every quiet retelling, the memory of the Titanic remains, not just as tragedy, but as a reminder of humanity's courage, hope, and calm in the face of the unknown. Thank you for listening to this story, for letting your thoughts drift through history and finding peace in its quiet echoes. May this calm night bring you rest, and may your sleep be as gentle as the sea after the storm.